Okay, welcome everyone to this afternoon's webinar. My name is Charlie Taylor, one of the continuing education consultants at KDLA. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on disaster preparedness and recovery, resilience planning for their libraries and communities. If you have any questions for our presenter today, please put them in the chat. She's going to kind of not be looking at that too closely. So if you'd like to chat in questions, I can hold them until the end, or if you just want to wait until the end. But if you have something that is particularly of interest to a slide that she's on, please go ahead and chat that in. And otherwise, we'll go ahead and address everything at the end of today's webinar. And if you have any technical issues as well, please go ahead and chat those in. I'll be here to help out with that. The PDF of today's slides is available back in Blackboard Learn under the PDFs and slides section, as well as a couple of extra handouts that Michelle has graciously provided for us that she'll be talking about during the webinar. And finally, our webinars are closed captioned. Those captions are available in two ways. There would have been a notification bar at the top of the screen to ask you if you'd like to see them. You can say yes to see them on this screen, or we also have a service called Stream Text. I'm going to paste that into the chat right now. And if you'd like to click on that, it will open up the captions in a separate window where you can adjust them and personalize them a little bit. So with all that being said, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker for today. She's Michelle Stricker, the Deputy State Librarian at the New Jersey State Library, and she is somewhat of an expert on this topic. We were super excited to get her to present for us. I know she's done this presentation a whole bunch of times, and yes, Alicia, same way. We're really excited, Michelle. So I'm going to go ahead and mute myself, and you can take it away.
Yeah, well, hi, everyone, and thanks for the kind words, Alicia. Charlie and Kentucky, thank you for having me here today. It's my pleasure. A couple of you shared in the chat box how the tornadoes affected you or someone that you know, and we were just all horrified as we watched what was going on down in Kentucky, and my heart goes out to all those who were personally affected. And somebody wrote, yes, it's going to be a long rebuild and recovery. Yes, absolutely. It's a long-term event, recovering from that. So today, let me say that this is a fairly new presentation that I'm doing, so I'll be curious to hear your comments about it, and I appreciate your comments because it just helps me fine-tune everything and make it better and more applicable to libraries, especially small to mid-sized libraries, because I want everyone to know that there is something that they can do to help their community. So I call today's session Resiliency Planning for Libraries and Their Communities. That's a little bit different from the Toolkit title that I had before, but I want to assure you that everything that I'm going over today really I have taken and adapted from emergency management. So let's get started. The year 2021 was marked by 58 major disaster declarations throughout the United States, with requests to FEMA for long-term recovery assistance. And 7 of those disaster declarations were the Colorado wildfires and what they call straight-line winds. Arkansas had severe storms and tornadoes. New York had Hurricane Ida, and so did New Jersey. Louisiana with Hurricane Ida. Washington State had wildfires, and California had wildfires, and of course Kentucky with your severe storms, your straight line winds, flooding, and tornadoes. So you got all of the above. In addition to the impact of these natural disasters, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to stress the capacity of essential workers and supplies. A community's ability to generate disaster resilience, which is to effectively prepare for and bounce back from catastrophic events, can help reduce the negative long-term impacts of a disaster. And the library plays a major role in helping restore a community to normalcy. I've presented on disaster preparedness many times now since Hurricane Sandy hit New Jersey in October of 2012. That was the worst storm in New Jersey's history. But then Hurricane Ida hit us last year, and Ida became the second worst storm in our state's history. And throughout the years, I've found so many different kinds of disaster preparedness plans that I've become confused about what should be used. And I think it must also be very confusing for librarians and library staff to sort of sort through everything and decide, what's the right approach to take and what are the right plans to fill out for your particular situation in library. So in this webinar, I hope to simplify it for you by selecting what I consider to be the most essential disaster planning and response tools that are easy to use, even if you are a very small library. I'm going to introduce you to 4 essential resources that I modified from emergency management that will help libraries rebound from disasters quickly and restore library services to a community in crisis more rapidly than ever. Complete all 4 and they will set you on the path to resiliency, both for your library and for your community. So how do we create resilience in the wake of disasters? A key element to successfully recovering quickly from a catastrophic event lies in the overall preparedness of the whole community. A prepared community is a resilient community. Libraries need to be prepared to restore services as quickly as possible in the aftermath of a disaster in order to help the public with their emergency needs and to ensure a community returns to normal life as quickly as possible. However, helping a community return to normalcy requires a good deal of planning and then adaptability to respond to the crisis at hand. So it's 2 sides of a coin: advanced planning and then on-the-spot adaptability. And the faster the response to restore library services, the faster you can provide essential information resources to help individuals and businesses within your own community. I recently attended a summit on natural disaster response and recovery sponsored by the New Jersey Association of Counties. I was the only librarian there, and everyone else were elected county officials. And I was struck by what the keynote speaker said, and the keynote was the New Jersey Department of Protection Commissioner. He told us that after a disaster, and I'm quoting him here, no one is coming to help you, not for 1 or 2 days. And federal help like FEMA won't be set up on site for 7 to 10 days. So don't count on federal resources right away. Now that's a long time to be without electricity, heat, air conditioning, food, basic necessities, and shelter. Communities seem that they're just a network of vulnerabilities. So you have to rely on yourself, meaning local resources like police, local fire, community groups, neighbors, and the library. There is nothing your state can do to protect the community in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. So think about that. No one is coming to help you. He also said that until 2050, that's 30 years from now, storms will become more frequent and more intense. And after that, if we take charge now to arrest climate change, those results will start to kick in. In New Jersey, that means we're going to get a 20 to 50% increase in rain and flooding. And it's not just flooding in New Jersey. Everyone thinks that that's, what we get because we're all along, the ocean coastline there. But last year, New Jersey had 775 wildfires. And so with fires, it always ends up then turning into a water disaster because that's what you need to use to put the fires out. So taking our lead from the experts in disaster response, emergency management, first responders, and FEMA, the resources presented in this webinar have been modified to fit the needs of the library community. My goal was to develop new tools to help libraries prepare and rebound more quickly from a disaster while being relatively quick and easy to complete and implement. So the focus is on rapid response, agility, and scalability in order to restore library service in some form as quickly as possible. Here are the 4 resources I'll talk about today. I think they are the most important tools you'll need for resiliency planning and response. All of these documents can be modified to fit your particular situation. There is no right way to complete any of these templates, and you'll understand why when I go over each of them individually. So we have the continuity of operations plan, which is called the Coup plan. And so the Coup is going to be, you can think of it as your new disaster plan. We'll talk about a seat at the table discussion guide, which gives you credibility as a partner with local responders like your local fire and police. And you'll see later on why I like to call librarians information first responders. We'll talk about FEMA's tabletop exercises that put you in the seat as a facilitator for your own community to help them with preparedness. And then the action plan is taken directly from the Emergency Responders Playbook for rapid disaster response at the scene of an incident. So this is really a deck of tools that focus on complete emergency planning rather than the typical emergency disaster planning that you may be familiar with. So resiliency planning versus disaster planning. What is the difference? While resiliency planning may contain elements of disaster planning, there are differences in focus, the process, and objectives. Resiliency planning generally takes a more holistic approach of a community, not just your library. Resiliency planning is highly participatory and engages the entire community, especially the most vulnerable populations. Resiliency planning is forward-looking and considers long-term changes and response to environmental conditions, as well as being adaptable to accommodate uncertainties in the aftermath of a disaster. Resiliency planning is aspirational, emphasizing community self-sufficiency. So let's begin going over the tools, and we're going to start with the continuity of operations plan, the Coup plan. The Coup becomes essential after a disaster once the library building and collections are stabilized. In some libraries, the Coup has totally replaced the traditional disaster plan altogether. I don't want to imply that you could take shortcuts in your disaster planning and mitigation efforts, but rather you will need a solid base of traditional disaster planning in order to get to the point where an abbreviated Coup plan will work for you. You will have to decide if that's the right decision for your library. The Coup addresses how the library will reopen in some capacity and resume services to the public, even if you need to make building repairs and salvage parts of your collections. So it details how staff will manage day-to-day operations of the library after a disaster. Both the traditional disaster plan and the Coup are an essential part of the library's disaster response and recovery toolkit. Now, sorry, let me go back one second for a minute. So the best Coup plan I've seen is this right here. It's from the Council of State Archivists, and it's called the Pocket Response Plan, the PREP plan. And you have the link up there is to the original document. And the version that I gave you has been modified for libraries and mostly for public libraries. You're going to need a small team to complete this document, which should really only take a morning or an afternoon to fill out. And it's a two-sided document that folds up to the size of a credit card and fits into your pocket, and hence the name, the Pocket Response Plan. So the pocket-sized Coup plan is the first document in your response toolkit. And here's the Coup that I sent to you and that I modified for libraries and sent as an attachment. Its actions have been color-coded into teams that are responsible for mobilization activities such as website and social media updates, reopening plans, delivery coordination, communications with the media and community, and more. I know it's a little hard to read and it doesn't make for the most thrilling PowerPoint, but I just wanted you to see this is about the size of it. And the color codes, you'll see like the red team will be the executive team and the blue team is the management team. Green is, the service continuity team. There's an IT team, and you'll be able to fill in all of these categories as you see fit, but you can also eliminate any that you feel that are not relevant to your library, and you can add in any more that you want. I think we gave you a Word document, so you'll be able to change it as need be. And then here's the flip side of the plan, and that lists all your resource contacts, your historical collection salvage priorities. So probably every library has a collection that, may be more important than, say, maybe the bestsellers, which are easily replaceable. Would be maybe your local history collections, which are irreplaceable. And so there's a place here that you can outline those. Your resource contacts are here, and a relocation strategy should your building sustain damage and you're unable to open for the time being. And then you can see it folds right up like a little credit card, and you put it in your wallet so that you always have it with you. So what's the difference between traditional disaster plans and the Coup plan? Well, traditional disaster plans, and I'm sure you recall those 100-page templates, still have their place, but are ill-suited in an emergency because they're all about internal response to your facilities and collections. There's a good chance that your old disaster plan, your library disaster plan, has become outdated. It's sitting up there on a shelf somewhere, if you even know where it is. So before you start working on the quick Coup plan, now is a good time to update the traditional disaster plan. Remember, the focus of that plan is on mitigating risk to your library facility and salvaging your collections. And the Coup plan is meant to augment it, and it's meant to move forward towards resuming services rather than saving what you have in your facilities. Traditional disaster plans are overarching and may be relevant regardless of the type of disaster or emergency, whether it's natural or man-made. The key difference is a Coup document, again, is forward action that focuses on agility and getting the library open and running again with the sole purpose of serving the community. There are many examples and templates for the traditional plans for free online, and you can choose the one best suited for your library. Perhaps the best known is the disaster preparedness template that was developed years ago by the Northeast Document Conservation Center. That's called D-Plan. And then there's also, that's the one that's 100 pages. And then there's D-Plan Lite for smaller institutions. And I think I recall that being around 25 pages or so. And as I said, these plans focus on mitigating risk and salvaging collections and not on resuming essential services to the community. However, they do have their place, since a library cannot reopen unless the building is stable, the collections are salvaged, regular library service, even if it's limited, is resumed. I'm going to sidetrack for a moment here about pandemic disaster planning, because COVID-19 exposed the major flaw and disaster preparedness plans. And that is, they didn't work in a pandemic. We have a tendency to focus on natural and man-made disasters that include chemical spills, civil unrest, with the sole purpose of saving our buildings and reopening to the public again as quickly as possible. But few libraries were prescient enough to foresee a worldwide pandemic that would cause a total disruption to life as we know it. And when you think about it, really, pandemics are nothing new. Why were we so surprised? Pandemics have been around throughout all of history. Smallpox, the Black Death, the Spanish flu, SARS. Why were we taken so surprised by COVID when experts were warning us that the thing that really was going to take us all out in the future was going to be some kind of a pandemic? So as a result of COVID, librarians and library staff had to respond quickly as the pandemic worsened and everything shut down. Literally the opposite of everything that we planned for. However, during this long period of quarantine, libraries did an excellent job of pivoting to virtual services and programs, which now have become an integrated reality of our working lives. Worth acknowledging here is the issue that not all people have access to virtual services due to multiple factors such as a lack of connectivity or digital literacy skills. And just look how the schools have online learning. 2 years later, and with Omicron raging still despite the headlines, many thousands of children still can't get reliable Wi-Fi for school. This pandemic has shown us that the digital divide remains worse than ever. So you can visit the ALA Pandemic Preparedness Planning site for a list of recommendations to follow for when the next pandemic hits or more variants of this one. It will put you in a better position to provide essential information and communication services to community members who are isolated, remote, disconnected, lack internet access, or use mobile devices exclusively. I want to sort of sidetrack here and point you to the Librarians Disaster Recovery and Community Resiliency Toolkit that was created by the New Jersey State Library. This is what I like to call a transition tool between the traditional disaster plan and the Coup plan. It's located on the New Jersey State Library website, and this resource is prepared as a guidebook and a companion workbook that features a series of quick checklists to complete a preparedness plan. It was actually created from the emergency management point of view by an emergency manager. So it's very different than the usual disaster preparedness plans we've seen. The toolkit includes instructions for developing a resiliency plan for your library and a personal readiness plan for staff. We don't hear enough about that. It then discusses how to modify your services to further meet the needs of your distressed community. And these may include modifying your hours, reconfiguring library space for large crowds, offering more story times to keep the kids busy so the parents can do their work in the library, and offering services such as charging stations for personal devices. And these are all, have become like sort of par for the course now as the years go by and the disasters that we all are facing have increased. The toolkit really targets your role as an information first responder, focusing on what librarians can do for your community to help them recover from a disaster, as opposed to the life-saving priorities of emergency first responders. But it does include instructions taken directly from emergency management. And you're going to see things in the toolkit such as a library safety warden program and an introduction to the incident command system, which is the language of emergency response, a section on crisis communications, and also with dealing with disruptive people. So these are the new additions that you're not going to see in a traditional disaster preparedness plan. And I wanted to say, just thinking of this, thinking back at the beginning and thinking about the tornadoes that hit Kentucky, in a case like that, you really can't prepare for that. You just, with that kind of devastation coming, you just have to evacuate as quickly as possible. So as I talk about these things, please keep that in mind, that there's just some disasters you can't prepare for, and I think Kentucky tornadoes were certainly one of those. Hang on a sec. Next slide. It's not letting me go back. There we go. The toolkit was updated last year with a new chapter on pandemics, epidemics, and infestations. And again, we had asked the emergency manager who wrote the first part of the toolkit to come back and do this next chapter. And it includes an operational checklist that highlights what actions librarians can take for a community-wide outbreak, and addresses a number of other illnesses, such as growing behavioral disturbances, I think, that all libraries are seeing these days. It is meant to augment the information from the toolkit, and it talks more about, working with your local, like I said, your local health offices, so that you can listen to whatever recommendations they have on how to handle a pandemic situation. So that was an explanation of your first tool, the one-page Coup plan with a lot of sidebars about traditional disaster planning, a review of that, and about the Librarians Toolkit. Please don't forget to look that up. It's free for anyone to use, and so you could share it widely. I'm sure you're going to find some of those checklists very handy that you could use for your own disaster planning process, and you could just pull out of that whatever you think is going to be relevant, again, to your particular circumstance. So next we're going to move on to a seat at the table discussion guide that's working with disaster task force and community volunteers. This guide was first created by the Disaster Information Management Research Center, and we call it DIMRIC for short. That's part of the U.S. National Library of Medicine. And it's meant to suggest ways librarians can work with local emergency responders, including public safety, police, emergency planners, fire and rescue, along with local community nonprofits and volunteer organizations. If it's a pandemic, like I said, your local health department is also going to be a resource for you. And as we have seen so many times now, libraries play a critical role in disaster recovery, serving as recovery centers, information and telecommunication hubs, and warming and cooling stations. Earlier in the presentation, I called librarians information first responders. So the objective of an information first responder is to quickly enable people to get back to work, back to their lives, and ensure recovery of a community's economic life. So we're not telling librarians that they're going to rush in alongside emergency personnel to help them with their work and saving lives. That's not the purpose of an information first responders. Rather, we need to identify and empower information first responders, because they make a difference between a lasting disruption from a disaster and a quick return to daily life. And libraries play a critical role in making this happen. Furthermore, libraries continue to play a role long after the disaster is over. And somebody even said that in the chat, it's going to be a long, lengthy recovery. And that is why it's even more critical for you to have a Coup plan in place. The library's role in helping the community recover from a disaster extends much longer than any other organization's. So think about it. Emergency management is going to withdraw once the emergency is over, once lives have been, stabilized, saved, rescue efforts have, been exhausted. And then government agencies that have come in, like FEMA, are going to pack up afterwards once all their forms are filled out and the aid has been distributed. But libraries have staying power in the community. And in New Jersey, we are still assisting people affected by Sandy today, and we're 10 years out from that, as well as adapting our virtual services during this current pandemic. So a seat at the table discussion guide is designed to help you start a dialogue with local and regional emergency responders so that the information resources you have to offer them and the community are remembered in a time of crisis. The discussion document includes a sample letter of introduction outlining the benefits of partnering with emergency personnel, and a script for you for a follow-up phone call and follow-up letters or emails. It also helps you write an elevator speech to communicate your value. It fosters an awareness of the vital role librarians play as information first responders as they communicate with elected officials and what we call boots on the ground emergency responders, who are typically so shorthanded after a disaster as they're dealing with saving lives and stemming damages from the crisis at hand. Additionally, this guide will help you search out partners with those faith-based groups and nonprofits in your community that are active after a disaster. You want to offer them a space in your library for their food and clothing drives and support them in any way you can as they offer critical aid to your neighbors. And this is how you start to build a whole community support team in times of great need. There's a planning process called asset-based community development. So asset-based community development. It's a place-based framework that builds on the skills, experiences, knowledge, and passions of local residents and local associations to help build a more sustainable community, one that is more resilient and relies on itself. And if you look up asset-based community development, you're going to find toolkits on how to use it online, but they call relying on itself, relying on its own gifts, gifts being organizations and people in the community are gifts, rather than looking for outside help that come and save me in a disaster. Because remember, we heard it from the emergency responders, no one is coming to help you immediately after a disaster. So I first saw a presentation on community asset-based community development by a New Jersey VOAD group, and that means volunteers operating after disasters. And they had been using this method of outreach for disaster preparedness in their communities for years. So it's definitely worth taking the time to looking that up and reading about it, and seeing if maybe you can use it in your own library and community. Just last week, I attended a presentation that I thought married these two different approaches to disaster response and recovery. So there's the emergency management approach, which is like a closed unit where they rely upon themselves in a disaster. They even have their own language. It's the language of the incident command system. And then there's the asset-based community approach that's used by volunteer groups that are active after a disaster. So the presenter was an emergency manager from Australia, and he discussed a new form of integrated emergency management system that better enables and supports a community-led response. Right now, help from the community or getting help from the community is not part of the emergency management plan. But the presenter has found that the people in the community in a crisis are in fact very capable and instinctively know what to do and how to help after disaster. They're going to naturally come together and help their neighbors find shelter, water, food, and medical aid. So the approach he was suggesting asks emergency managers to do the kind of exercises outlined in the seat at the table guide that I'm asking you to do as a library. It's flipping the conversation around and putting the onus on emergency management to involve the community in all recovery efforts, because the community knows best what it needs. And he discussed how to set up he called them community emergency information hubs, which is a place where people come to help each other during and after a disaster. Libraries were never mentioned in his presentation, but why shouldn't libraries be the center of an emergency information hub? I can't think of a better place to serve as the headquarters for this type of operation. And I'm going to think about this for a while, and I'm going to come up with a new presentation about it, because I thought it was a way of really moving the discussion forward by marrying the emergency management piece and the volunteer piece and the information piece all together. So I hope that all made sense. I thought it was a really fascinating presentation. Okay. It's essential that you make a connection with your local emergency responders and engage them as partners, because they may not be aware of the important role libraries play in community resiliency. So, as I said, you have to approach them yourselves and tell them about what you have to offer. And the guide is going to help you begin thinking through the relationships you need to build to have a seat at the table with disaster management in your town. And I listed just a couple of the discussion questions here. You want to ask your emergency management if you can join their conversations about risk assessment, mitigation, and preparedness planning in their area of coverage, which is going to include, your library and their area of coverage. You want to also ask to be incorporated into your county, state, and local preparedness exercise scenarios and action plans, because they practice these every year, and it would be great if you could be involved too. Start by establishing a primary point of contact at your local emergency management office. Request a seat at the table at their planning meetings, briefings, and updates. Realize that this partnership must be sustained, that training, outreach, and communication is an ongoing process. Make them realize the importance of getting the library open quickly after a disaster, because they can help you by restoring power quickly, clearing debris, and doing minor repairs around the library facility. It's necessary that you remain high on their priority list so that you can reopen to provide services to the community. And you can work on this plan together. Funding is not needed, or it's minimal. It should not be an obstacle in your partnership efforts. Sometimes the only thing that's needed is, time to attend the local meetings. And the same with the local nonprofits and volunteers who are frequently on the front lines, helping their neighbors, clientele, and communities recover. These groups step in immediately after a storm, but often lack the resources to continue serving communities that need long-term help. So moving on now, you have your Coup plan, and you've established a working relationship with emergency management and your local volunteer organizations. So the third tool in your resiliency planning, must be outreach to the community. So resource number 3 was developed by FEMA Region 2. And that's our region in New Jersey, New York, and also Puerto Rico is FEMA Region 2. And they are the only ones that have this particular set of trainings that they developed. And what it is, it helps train librarians and library staff on how to facilitate discussions within your own community to help people be safer, to be better prepared, and more resilient where they live, work, and play. The training introduces a series of easy to follow, what would you do scenarios. So as preparedness facilitators, which I'm calling you, the librarians preparedness facilitators, you'll learn how to navigate easy to use disaster scenarios in several different areas, such as hurricanes, civil unrest, pet preparedness, wildfire, and more. They're all listed up there. These tabletop exercises are designed to be low-stress discussions to enhance an individual's or a family's disaster preparedness, perhaps by making go kits for themselves and their pets, by learning how to load important documents onto a thumb drive, knowing evacuation routes, etc. And I'm going to emphasize pet preparedness here because if there's one thing emergency management has learned is that people are not going to leave their pets behind. So that's really important piece here. Current outreach and community programs have been successful in connecting with and supporting non-traditional users. So building on these connections with individuals and families is critical in times of crisis. Libraries are uniquely positioned to assist and advocate for these group programs, and in fact have an obligation to do so. This outreach piece is critical in building community resiliency. So here's what one of those discussions looks like, and I picked tornado for Kentucky, but remember, as what I said, what happened is really there's some things you cannot prepare for. You just have to evacuate as quickly as possible. But this example describes a scenario up top, and then it asks, what would you do via a series of group discussion questions? And they're listed there, 1 through 8. It then gives you a link down the bottom to see how you did with further recommendations. So what's so great about this resource is that it's a ready-made program for you that you can facilitate within your community that's very practical and very helpful. It's meant to take place as small in-person discussion groups that last about an hour. Obviously, at least in New Jersey, a lot of libraries really aren't open yet, or still doing like curbside service. So you can easily adapt these into virtual events, so you could still do community programming. So that's what these look like, and every single one of the scenarios kind of follows this format. And to recap so far, we've reviewed the Coup plan, which focuses on resuming library service, a seat at the table, which informs your discussions and partnerships with local emergency management and volunteer groups, and now the tabletop exercises, which allow you to serve as facilitators to help people in your community prepare for a disaster. And with that, we're going to move on to the last resource in your toolkit. And this is the 4th document, the Emergency Action Plan. Now, there's one key difference about this document from the last 3 we discussed. The EAP is the only document that cannot be, on the whole, completed before a disaster. The most important planning and response of the EAP takes place in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. So once again, taking our cue from emergency responders, librarians and library staff will need to quickly develop an emergency action plan at the point of crisis. that considers the unique circumstances of that particular disaster. So for example, a flood, let's take flooding, a flood that affects books in the teen section will require a different response from you than flooding in the computer lab, or say flooding in the street right outside the library. That's all has to do with flooding, but all three different kinds of responses. And an adroit response is going to save effort, conserve resources, and it gets achieved, results get achieved more rapidly. And this is where the emergency action plan comes in. This short conditional plan requires you to quickly assess the situation at hand and then modify the appropriate response action, something that just does not happen in the traditional sorts of disaster preparedness planning. Now, portions of the EAP may be completed ahead of time, such as the sections listing emergency personnel names and phone numbers, evacuation routes, and utility company contacts. And it does remind me of the Coup plan in that way. But the remainder of the document requires you to select the type of disaster at hand: fire, flood, chemical spill, power loss, extreme weather, bomb threats, etc. And then to assign critical personnel to handle various aspects of the disaster and manage their assignments. The EAP is a lean, agile method to suit response to the need. It is the primary document employed in situational awareness as applied to disaster response, and I'm going to discuss situational awareness in a few minutes. This is not a formal regulatory document. It's also not a FEMA document. I modified the EAP based on several forms I found online from emergency management. The most important element is the action plan you create at the scene of impact as soon as danger has passed and a response is needed. So the EAP outlines what do we want to do, who is responsible for doing it, how do we communicate with each other, and what is the procedure if someone is injured. After a disaster, there is a constant cycle of assessing and reacting to the incident. So the EAP is about redoing or updating the plan over and over again until you get to the recovery stage. Your library's response team is continually assessing and prioritizing from the first few minutes after a disaster to days and even months later. And in the initial response phase, you may not even have a chance to write it down. Remember, we're still talking about maybe the first few minutes after an incident occurs. So response is often mental. You're not just going to stop and say, oh, I can't respond now until I write this down, write the plan down. But at some point, and as soon as possible, the action plan will be written down and will continue to be modified. Elements of the EAP include emergency personnel names and phone numbers, personnel who are trained in emergency response, evacuation route maps that have been posted in each work area with emergency exits marked, primary and secondary evacuation routes, locations of fire extinguishers, fire alarm stations, and then assembly points outside of the library if you all have to evacuate. And then the type of emergencies that are going to be reported by site personnel are the typical, usual medical, fire, severe weather, bomb threats, chemical spills, extended loss, and other things like terrorist attacks and hostage taking. It's so important, the EAP, that FEMA has written an entire book about it, only they call it the Incident Action Plan. It's the same thing, and I believe if you go on the FEMA website, you can download this book for free. I mentioned the term situational awareness, and it's important to be familiar with that term. Situational awareness is the ability to respond quickly and to adjust your response to the disaster at hand. It's about making the right decision at the right time. How you respond to the chaos happening around you and quickly assess and then activate your response is going to be critical. So it's a mindset, really. It's not a skill. And situational awareness cannot be practiced like a disaster preparedness tabletop exercise, although those are very important. Those activities are very important to do, and they are very helpful. Situational awareness is the ability to quickly assess what happened in order to craft an appropriate response to the specific situation at hand. The resources discussed throughout this webinar help prepare you for a situational response. They're designed to be agile, adaptable, and scalable. They're short and relatively easy to complete as compared to other disaster planning tools. And they focus on getting up and running again quickly so you can help your community recover. Situational awareness means that you will make a critical assessment quickly that identifies actual and potential problems and to gauge the significance of each problem. Critical assessment always requires tackling the most significant problem first, and the priorities are always in this order: life and safety, incident stabilization, and preservation of facility and collections. This is the order all emergency responders will follow when they arrive at the scene. So all of these resource guides and tools still require preparation time and implementation in advance, but they do represent a new approach to resiliency planning. When used together, these 4 resources will provide you with a more responsive and situational approach to a crisis that enables a quick return to operations. Getting the library open and running again contributes to helping the community return to normal. And the faster a community returns to normal and gets back to work, the more resilient it will be. So to recap, the traditional disaster plan helps to stabilize the library structure by securing utilities, health and hygiene, restroom facilities, water, and your collections. The plan is static and can be lengthy depending on the amount of detail and the size of the library. The Coup plan focuses on reopening the library for service to the community as quickly as possible, and those services primarily include internet access, references services, comfort station with heating and cooling, serving as an operations base or a telecommunications center, a food and clothing distribution center, and offering some children's services so you can help them feel calm and feel like life is a little bit normal. And then both the Seat at the Table document and FEMA's Community Preparedness Facilitators Program are the links to the community with a focus on resiliency. One positions the library as working alongside of emergency management and volunteer organizations, and the other features public programming with a focus on disaster readiness for your neighbors. The Emergency Action Plan is the most agile document of the group. Based on plans used by emergency management, the EAP is implemented at the point of crisis and is meant to be adaptable and scalable. So it's critical that you take care of yourself first and your family first, and then turn your attention to reopening the library so you can help your neighbors after a disaster. Think of it as a concentric circle where you're working outwardly from home and then to work and then to the community. And by using these resiliency planning tools, a library can rapidly stabilize its own infrastructure, restore essential services, customize operations to suit demand, and best of all, resume its role as the heart of a wounded but well-prepared community, helping all return to normalcy as soon as possible. So I want to thank you for your time today. I hope you have found the resources discussed to be helpful and informative. Remember that you were all information first responders, and yes, I did have these pins made that when I went to conferences, I would give them out to attendees in the audience. And I am here if you have any questions for me. So Charlie, I have not been looking at the chat box at all. And so I'm going to turn it over to you to see if were any comments or if there were any questions for me.
Hey, Michelle, great presentation. Excellent, excellent information. No questions so far. I want to definitely encourage everybody to go ahead and chat those in while we're wrapping up. If there's any additional information you'd like to get from Michelle while we have her here, any situations you'd like to ask her about. One thing that I was curious about, Michelle, if this was something that you all have experienced in New Jersey libraries. We kind of heard after the tornadoes that the libraries did a great job, particularly the libraries, that were close to a lot of the damage, but weren't necessarily damaged. They were really reaching out as much as they could to provide programs, provide assistance, and not necessarily getting a ton of people attending, I guess, not getting a lot of people responding to that. It was sort of like people were hunkered down, it had been very traumatic. And curious in that sort of situation, you just recommend that the libraries kind of stay the course, or change their tact in that situation. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's interesting because the exact opposite happened in New Jersey, and I'm going to just use Hurricane Sandy as an example. The day after Hurricane Sandy, and we have photographs of this from that library submitted from all over the state. People showed up at their local libraries in droves. There were lines that went halfway around the block for people just waiting to get in. After this hurricane, which really, it kind of went up. It started in South Jersey, up the coastline, and then tore right through the center of the state, up north. And just like you just mentioned here, we found that in Hurricane Sandy, homes and businesses were the ones that were affected and devastated. But the libraries, they may have lost power, but the buildings were pretty much left intact. So, they whether they were ready or not, the public showed up at their door the next day. Now, with what happened in Kentucky, and that's interesting that you said a lot of the libraries were open, but maybe some of them did not have sort of like the people showing up like you may have expected. Well, number one, I mean, it's total shock, that kind of devastation from the photos that I've seen. Just absolutely incredible. So I would think that people would be in shock about maybe losing someone, losing all of their possessions, their entire home, picking through the wreckage possibly the next day. So they're not going to really be thinking about going to the library where they can sit with their laptop and continue working. And that's what happened in New Jersey. There was a lot of flooding. It was mostly flooding from Hurricane Sandy. So they lost power. They were flooded out of their homes. So they had to leave their homes in order to go find FEMA, or go to the local library to charge up their devices, things like that. The thing about making the connections, though, ahead of time is that your community is not going to know what you have to offer after the disaster happens. So this is something that you have to start on and work at and publicize well before, along with letting emergency management know what resources you have to let your community know what resources you have, and that after a disaster that they can come to you, and these are the sort of services that you're going to be providing. So you can't sort of start after the fact. You have to work on this all the time. So I hope that's helpful.
Absolutely. I think that's good information. Great recommendation. And I'm just going to move to the end here real quick. We have to thank the Institute of Museum and Library Services for their sponsorship of this webinar and our services at KDLA. And just feel free to contact us if we can ever be of any help. And just a couple of final words. I did put in the survey link in the chat if everybody wouldn't mind to take that real brief, I think it's 4 or 5 question survey about today's webinar. We'd appreciate that. The webinar was recorded and it will be available within a week's time in our online portal to go back and review, or for have your staff to come and watch it. The PDF of today's slides, as well as all the resources that Michelle talked about today, are available in Blackboard Learn. You can go ahead and download those. And you'll also be getting your certificate of attendance that will be available in your learner dashboard within a week, and you'll get an email when that's available. So, and I'm just going to back up to Michelle's last slide there so you can see her contact information. If you have any additional questions, thank you, Michelle, for being willing to take those. So
thanks for having me, Charlie, and thank you, Kentucky. And my thoughts are with you, and best of luck as you go forward, especially out in Western Kentucky, recovering from those tornadoes. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Everybody have a great afternoon, and when you're ready to exit, you can just close the tab or window that you have open. Thank you again, Michelle. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.